right. So this is the first of three classes between now and Tisha B'Av. And I wanted us to explore what I think is a very interesting topic. And it's one that emerges from a particular teaching of Rav Kook. And as you all probably know, the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av are not an easy time. I personally have never found the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av to be particularly easy or enjoyable. I don't like being unable to shave. It's usually the hottest part of the summer. It's a time when I want to have fun and not feel bad. But every year we get to the 17th of Tammuz, which is the beginning of the 3 weeks. And this year it's particularly early in the summer. And nevertheless, the time begins. And it's not a time that we're supposed to feel joyful. The Gemara says when we get to Rosh Chodesh Av, a week or so from now, Misha nichnas Av mima'atin b'simcha, that when we get to Av, we're supposed to actively reduce our joy. And as you all know, one of the major themes during the 3 weeks is our attempt not just to feel bad for the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, but to on some level take responsibility for it and try to think how we can rectify the sins that our ancestors engaged in and that we continue to engage in that prevent the world and the Beit HaMikdash from being rebuilt. So this is a time of traditionally for sadness and for mourning. There's also another way to look at these 3 weeks, and there's a famous teaching by Rav Kook, we'll look at it just a moment, in which he says that if the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred, then the only way to rebuild it is through ahavat chinam. Difficult word to translate. I'll translate it as unconditional love, right? So this is a time we're supposed to be thinking about sinat chinam, all the ways we do bad, terrible things to each other and how we should stop doing that. It's also a time to think about ahavat chinam, of thinking about how we can show love to each other, which is not such an easy idea. And we're going to explore this idea of love and what it might mean through a variety of different perspectives. Today, we're going to look at the verse, the mitzvah, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, as at least one entry point into this idea that we're supposed to be thinking about how unconditional love can actually be redemptive, that love can be redemptive, right? That it can repair, it can rebuild, though it's not always so clear exactly how that can take place. So we'll look through a variety of perspectives, but the major perspective I want to kind of explore throughout a lot of this is a psychoanalytic one. So we're going to spend a lot of time on Sigmund Freud tonight and here today, I should say, and his understanding of love. If anybody's read Freud, love is all over his writings. It's all over the place because he recognizes that love is a central part about what makes us tick. And he spends a lot of time trying to understand exactly what love is, what love does, and recognizing the ways that it acts in our lives. So he's going to be a major touch point for us, but we're also going to see about, I would say, going beyond Freud as well. So as I mentioned here, Rav Kook has this famous teaching: the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred. It'll be rebuilt through ahavat chinam, unconditional love. But again, it's very hard to know exactly what this means. I've always been attracted to this idea in Rav Kook. I've studied Rav Kook extensively. I've written on Rav Kook. He doesn't really explain so thoroughly what ahavat chinam might be, what it might mean to engage in unconditional love. It's not free love of the 60s, I can tell you that much. But what I think it means, at the very least, is that it has to be connected to this mitzvah of v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love your neighbor as yourself. And the reason for that is that there is a whole host of rabbinic texts which emphasize the importance of v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, right? That the mitzvah of loving your neighbors yourself is not just any old mitzvah, it's a big mitzvah. It's an important mitzvah, right? Some people might even say it's the most important mitzvah. And if that's the case, then there's got to be something there that can shed light on this idea of chinam, of unconditional love that Rav Kook is talking about. So as you probably know, the verse appears in Vayikra, Perek Yud Tet, Parshat Kedoshim. It's part of a whole list of different mitzvot. Some are interpersonal, Ben Adam L'Chavero. Some are about the way we relate to God, Ben Adam L'Makom. And the verse itself, it clearly connects between You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge. Lo tikom v'lo titoret b'nei amecha. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ani Hashem. Love your fellow or your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Right, that's the verse. Right, it's one as part of a much larger list of mitzvot, but it has certainly taken on, I would say, outsized significance, and that's because, as I said, there's a lot of rabbinic sources that tell us this is an important mitzvah. It's a very important mitzvah. One of the more famous examples of this is in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in which Rabbi Akiva famously says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zehu klal gadol b'Torah." Right, Rabbi Akiva says that this mitzvah is the great principle of the Torah. Right, if you have to try to distill the Torah down into its essence, right, this is it. Right, and this line from the Gemara is so well known that it's been turned into a song by like Bnei Akiva, right? So this is like pretty significant. And you're also probably aware there's a famous Talmudic story of the convert who comes to Hillel. He wants to join the Jewish people. He wants to convert, but he makes the condition, right? I only will convert if you teach me the Torah on one foot, right? I only will convert if you can distill the Torah down into something that I can basically internalize in 30 seconds or less. Now, this is an outrageous condition, but nevertheless, Hillel is willing to agree to it. And he says to the convert, that which you dislike or hate, you shouldn't do to others. And the rest of the Torah is commentary, and go and study it. Right. So even in that example, too, Hillel, when he has to distill the Torah down, right, don't do to others what you find hateful, right, certainly is pretty closely related to the idea of love the other, love your neighbor or your fellow as yourself. So that's the background. It's a central mitzvah. It's an important mitzvah. Maybe it's the essence of the Torah. And as I want to argue, on some level, it's redemptive. At some level, it brings the ability to rebuild that which is broken. But all that being said, love is really complicated, right? It's a big word, and it's not always so clear what it means, and it's not always so clear how it's really active in our lives. So to get a better sense of love and what it might mean, and what does it mean to love another person, we're going to, as I said, spend some time looking at Freud. Now, Freud was not a religious Jew. I'm sure you know that, but he was raised in a nominally traditional Jewish home. And even as a secular Jew, he identified very strongly and very proudly as a Jew. Right? He had no interest in converting outside of Judaism to Christianity, which was an option for him. He wanted to be Jewish, even as a secular Jew. And many of those involved in psychoanalysis from the very beginning, many of his students were all Jewish, to the extent that it was referred to later on by the Nazis, psychoanalysis, as the Jewish science, because there were so many Jews involved in it. Now, Freud's writings are secular, but one of the more interesting things about them is the way in which he engages religious themes and questions. Religion as a theme and the issues that religion raises are very interesting for Freud. And for him, the question of the neighbor, how we relate to the neighbor, right, the other, and can and should we love them, is something that is very, very important to him. And he comes back to it over and over again. In particular, what he recognizes, and this is a fundamental principle of psychoanalysis, is that human beings are never islands unto themselves. Who we are and how we act in this world is always tied up with other people. It may begin with our parents or our family, but we never escape people, even as we grow up. Right? In human psychology, other people are our greatest joy and our greatest frustration. So if psychoanalysis, psychology is about this deep recognition about that who we are is so much tied up with how we relate to others, then that's why Freud spends a heck of a lot of time trying to understand the ins and outs of how we relate to other people. So in one of his books, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, he uses this very interesting metaphor that he takes from another German philosopher, Schopenhauer, about the way we relate to other people. And the whole book is about groups and how people come together to form groups. But here's what he says about the way we relate to other people, particularly the neighbor, right? The person who's close to us, but not necessarily a family member. He says, according to Schopenhauer's famous simile of the freezing porcupines, no one can tolerate a too intimate approach to the neighbor. So we're going to talk for a moment about the porcupines because it's a great metaphor. But Freud's basic point is that we have neighbors, and it's not so easy having neighbors. And you've probably heard the expression, right? Good fences make good neighbors. I'm assuming you've all heard that. And you all probably kind of know what it means, that like We like our neighbors. We want to have good relationships with our neighbors, but it's important that we have boundaries between us and our neighbors. That, as Freud says here, we don't want to get too close, right? Each one's got to have their own space, so to speak, right? And any of you have had difficult neighbors, right? Part of that's because usually somebody's pushing over the boundary a little bit too much, and that makes it very difficult. It's playing the music too loud, their stuff is all in the street, right? Usually a bad neighbor is somebody who's like not respecting that boundary that exists. But here's how he explains the Schopenhauer. Here's how the Schopenhauer metaphor. He says, because he compares us and our neighbors to porcupines. Here's what he says. He says, a company of porcupines crowded themselves very close together one cold winter day so as to profit by one another's warmth, and so to save themselves from being frozen to death. Meaning porcupines, when it gets cold, have no choice but to huddle together to share each other's warmth, right? If they don't come together, they can't get warm. However, there's a problem, because what do porcupines have? Porcupines have quills, right? And so the metaphor goes on. But soon they felt one another's quills as they got close, which induced them to separate again. Because when they got too close, they started pricking each other, poking each other, and it was painful, so they had no choice but to separate. And now, when the need for warmth brought them nearer together again, the second evil arose once more, right? This basically keeps happening, right? They're cold, so they come together for warmth, but they start poking each other and it's painful, so they separate, but then it's cold, and then they have to come back together for warmth, right? This back and forth. And then Schopenhauer concludes, he says, so that they were driven backwards and forwards from one trouble to the other until they had discovered a mean distance at which they could tolerably exist, right? So basically, what Schopenhauer is saying here in his little parable, right? This is good fences make good neighbors. You want to be close to your neighbors, but not too close, right? It's about finding the right balance. Because when you get too close, right, it's actually painful. So we have to understand like why this is such a powerful, parable, and what Freud is trying to, why he's citing it here, and what's so important. So number one, we have to understand is that human beings are naturally ambivalent toward each other. We like people, we need people, but we often find out that when we get too close to people, there are always things about them that bother us or upset us, and that they don't do things exactly the way we like, and they don't always agree with us in the way that we want, and they often disappoint us. They get angry at us for the things that we've done wrong that we don't even think we've done wrong. And when you get too close, you get hurt. But at the same time, as I said, we desperately need people. We need community, and we can't separate ourselves too much, right? And so this is like the fundamental dilemma of being human. We need people, but it's so hard to be with people a lot of the time. Now, Schopenhauer claims that we find this balance, right? He says there's a mean point, right? That instead of going back and forth, right, getting pricked and going back and getting pricked and going back, we find some sort of like good enough space where we're close enough to get the warmth, but not too close that we get pricked. But I kind of disagree with Schopenhauer a little bit, at least for my time as a rabbi, because what also often happens, and maybe these are the two, bad case scenarios, but they often happen, is that there are a lot of people who never find that median space where they can be a little bit warm but not pricked. A lot of people just end up going back and forth their whole life, oscillating back and forth between, again, feeling drawn to someone, you find them interesting, you develop a new friendship, you care about them, but at some point they do something that upsets you or hurts you, and then you start to pull back. And we say that we won't let ourselves go through it again. But then we find somebody new and we go through the same cycle over and over. So there's a lot of people that just go through this over and over, getting close, and then becoming hurt again and again and pulling away. And they just go through that over and over and over. And it's very, very hard. And it may sound depressing, but there's actually an even worse option that I see people go through. In Schopenhauer's times, you needed other people to live. Right? You just always you needed other people for warmth. There was no way around it. Without relationships, you couldn't survive in the world. But today it's different. It's now too often the case that when we get too close to the neighbor and we get pricked and we run away, that we decide we're going to hide ourselves from the world forever. Right? We lock ourselves in our homes and we live a solitary life. It's not something even our grandparents really could have ever imagined. Right, this idea of like living alone, like entirely. But technology makes these things possible, right? You have a phone, you have the computer, you can order things. I mean, you can see people over the phone or you can see people over video like we're doing. It's easier than sometimes seeing them in person, right? In my opinion, right, this sense where you can live a totally isolated life where you don't even really need to get close to people, that's like a new development. And in some ways, I think it's actually even worse than, oscillating back and forth between getting close and getting hurt and running away. But that's the reality that we live in, being with other people and making enduring relationships with other people. It's really hard. And many times it's even like excruciatingly hard. I mean, I have to be honest. So that's the first piece of Freud that I want us to think about. The second piece we're going to look at is from Civilization and Its Discontents. And he has a long exposition here on the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Remember I said he's interested in religious questions and religious themes, and he's really getting into it here as part of a larger analysis that he's doing. And he really wants to try to understand what is this mitzvah all about? This idea that you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, right? Is this like, and he holds it up there, as he knows, cultures, religions hold it out there as a mandate, right? It's this ideal that we're all supposed to live up to. And he's a little bit, you might say, pessimistic about this mitzvah. He's not so sure it's doable, at least in the way that it's often understood, and that bothers him. And one thing I want to say about Freud is that he may come across a little bit as cynical and pessimistic, as we're going to see, but Freud in many ways is a realist. I think Freud understood human beings better than 99.9% of anybody who's ever lived. And so I think it's worth taking Freud seriously. So he opens up, I said, by just trying to explore, like if you just encountered this idea for the first time, that there's an ethical mandate to love the neighbor as yourself, like what does this mean? And he says, let us adopt a naive attitude towards it as though we're hearing it for the first time. We shall be unable then to suppress a feeling of surprise and bewilderment. Meaning if all you have is this mitzvah, how do you understand this? It's very vague, very, very vague. Love your neighbor as yourself? Like, what does that even mean? Like, what does that translate into? Like, what is that? What am I being held accountable to? So he goes on to say, why should I do this? What good will it do us? But above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible, right? That's the question here. So he opens up with something that I think is very interesting, which is a definition of love, right? And love is something that is often too overused in today's world. Even titling these series of classes about love, I'm always a little worried that the more you use the word, the more it gets watered down. Love is not so easy to define. That's why I like Freud's definition, because I think it's a good one. If it was obvious what love is, we would never question whether we love someone. And if you watch like romantic comedies or many different movies, right, the whole central tension of a lot of movies and television shows is one of the characters struggling to determine whether or not they're in love with somebody, right? That's like a major theme, right? Do they love them or do they not? So if it was obvious what love is, that wouldn't be such a hard question to answer. You'd know it. We'd all know what love is. And when you feel it, you would say, it's love, right? The very fact that love isn't so easy to define is why it's such a big question for us. Do we love this person or not? But Freud here offers, in my opinion, one of the best definitions of love that I think you can find. So he says here, it's just these 3 sentences, but I think there's a lot going on here. First, he says, my love is something valuable to me, which I ought not throw away without reflection. So his first point is love is valuable, right? It's something precious. And as we know, something that's valuable or precious is not common, right? It's not found everywhere. Something can't be valuable or precious if it's like all over the place, right? It's something that's rare or is something that's precious. That's the first thing. Love isn't something you're going to encounter and experience all the time, because if you did, it wouldn't be that valuable, right? It'd be like all the other things that you encounter and experience all the time. So there's something about love that, again, is valuable, it's rare, it's precious. And it's not, as he says here, thrown away without reflection. It's something that's serious, right? Something that's important. It's not something we like just make jokes about or say, hey, I'm going to give so-and-so some love today, right? No, there's something, it's serious, like it's big deal. That's point number 1. He goes on and he says, and this is maybe the most important line here of the entire section, he says, love imposes duties on me, for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. And I really, really like this line. Love imposes duties. When you love somebody, it means you are responsible for them. It means you are obligated to them. It means you have to be willing to make sacrifices to them. And the reason I think I like this line so much is it's so Jewish, right? This is what love means. Is like you're bound to that person now. You're responsible to them, and it's not easy, right? If I want to give you the most obvious Jewish parallel here, right, it's God, right? The very fact that we love God and that God loves us is what binds God and the Jewish people together, right? That we're now have responsibilities to each other, obligations to each other, and again, this need to potentially even make sacrifices to the other, right? So that line I think is very, very important. And the last line he says here in his definition is that if I love someone, he must deserve it in some way, right? Love isn't something we just sort of throw out to the world, like, and whoever catches it, catches it. For Freud, it's got to be deserved, right? It's not just something we throw around. It's something that's got to be deserved or earned for the right person. And I remember I was once dating somebody before Jen, if you can believe it, my wife. And I had been dating this woman not that long. And I remember she said that she loved me. And I remember being completely flummoxed when she said this. And she really wanted me to say, like, I loved her back. And I did not do that at the time because I didn't feel that way. And it was essentially Freud's point here. Like, love has to be deserved. Just because someone says I love you doesn't mean like, okay, now you've earned the right for me to say I love you back. If anything, people say I love you oftentimes to trap you, right? It's like, I'm going to prove like how I feel, and you're going to have to say it back to me, right? That's really not the way love is. As Freud says here, love has to be deserved. And what's interesting here about Freud's definition of love is if we normally conceive of love in terms of romance, Freud is not really talking about romance here. If anything, because love exceeds romance. Love isn't just about a romantic relationship. It's about a relationship that you can have with anybody, right? And so again, for Freud, love is valuable, which means it's rare and it's precious. Love imposes duties, obligations. It means you potentially owe things to the person that you love and you're going to make sacrifices for them. And that love is deserved or earned. It's not just something we give to anybody. So based on all that then, so who does one love? Like, how do we know who we're supposed to love? How does this be made real? And this is where I think Freud makes some very important and even I would say slightly uncomfortable points. He says he deserves it. The one we love deserves it if he is so like me in important ways that I can love myself in him. And he deserves it if he is so much more perfect than myself that I can love my ideal of my own self in him. Now, this sentence here by Freud is very important because it reflects the notions of love that for him appear throughout all of his writings. And I'll just say, again, the most straightforward way. Freud recognizes that we love other people because through loving other people, we love ourselves, right? And what he's saying here is that we love other people because they're like us. Love is often about commonality. Right, the more one is like us, the easier it is to love them. And we often find this all the time. We are drawn to those who come from the same places as us, who have had similar experiences as us, right? The more they're like us, the easier it is for us to connect to them, right? The easier it is to love them. And Freud's point is the reason that's the case is because you love them because they're like you. And that's easy because you're loving yourself when you do that. And I mean, even just to give a very simple practical example, right? Think about Jewish geography, right? We're supposed to love our fellow Jews, right? Not always so easy. But what's the first thing you do when you meet a Jew and like you're in the middle of nowhere, right? You start trying to find out if you know people in common, right? Because that sense that like, oh, you're from, Los Angeles and I know so-and-so who lives in Pico Roberts in Los Angeles. And wow, my friend's sister's cousin. Wow. Like now we're connected, right? We have that commonality. Or like Jewish geography is, in a certain sense, like this, right? You can connect to your fellow Jew because once you see how they're connected to you, then it suddenly makes sense. That's point number one, that we often love other people because they're like us. And then the second point is really an extension of that we often love other people, even when they're maybe a little bit different from us, because they reflect our values and ideals. Like we see our best self in them. Right? They are the better version of what we want to be. And because of that, we can love them because they're like, wow, that's the person I want to be like, right? And I love them because of it. But in truth, you're still really only, loving yourself in that process. So if we take these 2 points here, then, so how do we determine who we might love? So Freud goes on, he uses the example of a friend's son. He says, again, if I have to love him if he is my friend's son, right? This is now somebody who's like 1 to 2 degrees removed, not my friend, but my friend's son. Because since the pain my friend would feel if any harm came to him would be my pain too, I should have to share it, right? I love my friend's son because if anything happens to my friend's son, it'll hurt my friend and that'll hurt me. But for Freud, yet again, love is ultimately all about who in the end? It's ultimately about yourself. Or even when you kind of push a little bit beyond to somebody who you're maybe not directly connected to, it's still about you in the end. And the reason this is significant, because as you can probably tell by now, Freud's whole approach to love, his belief about love, he just thinks this is the way love works, is primarily narcissistic. For most people, he's saying, pretty much everybody all the time, love is like looking in the mirror. You love that which looks like you. And the more you have in common, the more you love them. And the problem, of course, with this approach, and Freud recognizes this, but he's saying this is the reality, is that narcissistic love isn't really about the other person at all. Like I said, when you look in the mirror, you don't see somebody else, you see yourself there. And the reason I think this is problematic is because it's really kind of the opposite of unconditional love, right? This ahavat chinam. It's all conditional on very clear things, that the person is like you. And if they weren't like you, there wouldn't be love there at all. And if you think back to the famous Greek myth of Narcissus, it's about this individual, this man named Narcissus, and there's a nymph who falls in love with him named Echo, but he ignores her because, as we know, he's really only in love with himself. And what happens is he's by a pond one day in the forest, and he sees his reflection in the pond, and he falls in love with his reflection. And he falls in love with his reflection, but he's also kind of frustrated because he can't, it's the reflection in the water. He can't actually like really talk to it or connect to it or whatever, but he can stare at it and he can stare at himself. And he's so transfixed by his reflection, he's so in love with it, that he stops eating and he eventually dies, right? But when you hear that myth, it doesn't sound particularly positive. It's not a good thing to be called a narcissist. I don't think anybody here wants to be called a narcissist. But Freud is saying that's the way love works. We may think narcissistic love is somewhat immoral. Freud doesn't, for the most part. He just thinks it's pretty much impossible for us to love somebody who's really fundamentally different from who we are, who's genuinely strange or different from us in very significant ways. And he goes on to say, if the person's a stranger, and if he cannot attract me by any worth of his own or any significance, right, it will be hard for me to love him, right? If it's a stranger, somebody I don't know, somebody I don't have any common with, I'm just not going to love him, right? And then he goes on to say, if the idea here is from V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha is that we're supposed to have some sort of universal love, we're supposed to love everybody, he's like, that's impossible, right? If I'm supposed to love everybody, at best, people are going to get just the smallest, teensiest bit of my love. Because again, as he said before, love is rare, love is precious. If you're giving it to everybody, it can't be worth that much at the end of the day. And again, I would say Freud is pretty cynical about this mitzvah, but on the same time, I think he's also deeply, deeply realistic, right? So for Freud, just to summarize, we love those who are like us. We love those who benefit us in some way. They're doing good things for us. And the neighbor or stranger who isn't like me, who's different, is really too hard to love. Any idea of universal love is basically too much. Now, as I said, you may disagree with Freud that he's calling us all narcissists, but here's the problem, and I think it's a problem worth thinking about. If you look at all the people in your life, all the people that you think you love or you say you love, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to find someone who doesn't fit the criteria that Freud laid out, right? Everybody that we love, often on some level, is a narcissistic love, right? That they are like us. They represent things that we like. They do things that are good for us, right? That's true about almost I would say everybody that we love in our lives. So even if we don't like Freud calling us all narcissists, there's some truth here that I think we have to really grapple with. And the question really is that, is V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha just telling us to be good narcissists, try to extend our self-love as far as it can go? Or is it actually asking for something more than that? So if we turn to the Jewish tradition, we have to ask ourselves, what do the rabbinic texts say? Are they like Freud? Are they not like Freud? So the interesting thing is that while Freud, as I said, was not a religious man, His insights don't differ dramatically from, I would say, the core approach to V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, which is very interesting. So if we look at Ramban and Rambam, it's probably the two most important Jewish thinkers in Jewish history. They both say similar things to Freud. Ramban, he actually says that the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, he says it's an exaggeration. He says this mitzvah is here, and we're supposed to try to act ethically towards others, but it's not something that we can really live up to, that we can love everybody as much as we love ourselves. Because again, the human heart is incapable of loving someone else to the same degree that one loves himself. Furthermore, Rabbi Akiva's already come and taught us a legal principle that your life takes precedence over your fellow's life. So there's a famous story in the Gemara. If two people are in the desert and one of them has a bottle of water and the other doesn't, do you have to give up your bottle of water to the other person? And basically, Rabbi Akiva says, no. If you have the water, your life comes first, right? And what Ramban and Rabbi Akiva are basically saying here, that there's a certain basic egoism to who we are, right? That we put ourselves first. That's natural, and it's not really going to be overcome, right? And because that's the case, V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha can't be really fundamentally moving beyond this sort of narcissism that we all have, that we're all kind of wrapped up in ourselves. And, there's something true about that. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, also says something, fairly similar. So first off, when he says, what's this mitzvah zachar kamocha, he says, mitzvah kol adam lahavit kol echad v'echad Yisrael kegufo. He says the mitzvah is to love Jews. Right, and that's significant. Most rabbis think the mitzvah is to love Jews. Some certainly think the mitzvah extends beyond Jews. But if the mitzvah is only to love Jews, it makes it more sensible, at least to Freud. Right? Why would Freud think it makes more sense if the mitzvah is only about loving Jews? Because Jews are like you, right? And it's reasonable to love people who are like you. And the Rambam goes on. He says, "She'amar v'ahavta l'orecha kamocha lefikach." So what's the fulfillment of V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha? How do we live up to this according to the Rambam? He says, therefore, you need to praise the other, your neighbor, and you should worry about their money, just as you would worry about your own money and worry about your own kavod, your own honor or dignity. So what's interesting here is if this mitzvah is supposed to be this really big, important mitzvah, right? You'd think the bar should be set very high for what it means to fulfill it. But the Rambam points out that the bar is actually not so high. To fulfill this mitzvah, all you got to do is two things: praise other people and watch out for their money. As I said, it's not a terribly high bar. If my wife was to say to me that her love for me only goes so far, such that she'll say to me, I'll be nice to you and not try to spend too much of my money, I would probably say that's not enough. That's not enough for loving me. Like if that's all you're going to do, that's not like good enough. Now, I'll be honest. There are a lot of relationships in which one of the spouses doesn't do even these things, where they don't speak nicely about the other person and they're not so careful about the money. But at the end of the day, these aren't enough to really define what love should be. If I'm in a hospital and I have a terrible illness, I would want my wife by my side with me. It wouldn't be enough for her to say, look, I've done my part. I'll make sure to praise you and I'll do a good job looking after the house, right? If Freud said it well, love is something valuable. It imposes duties on me for the fulfillment of which I must be ready to make sacrifices. If love is about duty and sacrifice, then it should be more than what the Rambam is saying here. And what the Rambam really goes on to describe here and somewhere else is that loving the neighbor is about gemilut chasadim, acts of chesed. And I think acts of chesed are incredibly important, but I'm not sure they're the redemptive, transformative love that Rav Kook was talking about. In the end, what you see here is that the Ramban and Rambam are not so different from Freud. They may require a bit more than Freud. Freud is not even so sure you should do good things for the neighbor unless obvious because they're like you or it makes sense. But Rambam and Ramban are not setting the bar, too high either. They're still about giving to the person who's like you, the Jew, and you can't go too far because that would be impossible anyway. Now, what's interesting is that we shouldn't give up. I want to say on this idea that V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha can be about this ahavat chinam, this unconditional love that Rav Kook was talking about. That because there's a very, very, very interesting suggestive rabbinic text that opens the door to us to think about V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in a different kind of way. And that is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Fifth parak. I mean, I'm not sure you're familiar with it or not. It's fairly well known, but I'll read it. It's kol ahava shitluya b'davar batel davar b'tzela ahava. Right? All love that is dependent on something, like something specific, concrete, when that thing ceases to exist, the love ceases to exist as well. And the Mishnah goes on. Ahava v'she'ena tluya b'davar eina b'tel la'olam. But if love is not dependent on anything, any specific thing, then love will be there forever because it's unconditional. Ezehi ahava hatluya b'davar ahava Amnon b'tamar v'she'ena tluya b'davar zo ahavat David v'Yonatan. So then the Mishnah goes on to identify what are these two examples of love: conditional love and unconditional love. Conditional love is Amnon and Tamar. It's a biblical story we'll get into in a moment. And unconditional love is David and Yehonatan. David, who becomes the king, and Yehonatan is Shaul's son. So the Mishnah here does seem to think there's an idea of conditional love and unconditional love, and gives these two examples as a way of fleshing it out. So what was fascinating to me is, remember I said up until now, Freud presents this narcissistic love. You're only going to love those that are like you at the end of the day. Sorry, you think you can go beyond that? You can't. At the end of the day, you're going to love those who are like you, or those who benefit you, or those who represent your ideals. And as I said, there are rabbinic sources that kind of seem to edge that way too. But then I came across the commentary to this Mishnah by the Tiferet Yisrael, or by Yisrael Lifshitz, who's a late 19th century or mid-19th century rabbi, very well known for his commentary on the Mishnah. And he offers what is very much a Freudian interpretation of love here, but also understands that there's a love beyond narcissism, an unconditional love. And that's the kind of love that the Torah ultimately requires of us. So I want to go through his commentary because it's really fascinating to me that he anticipates Freud in the sense that most love is narcissistic, but he also says you can go beyond that. So when he opens up here on the Mishnah, which said, love that is dependent on something, and he tries to explain, what does it mean that it's dependent on something? He says, this means something that is a means to an end separate from the essence of the lover and the beloved, right? You love somebody, but what you really love is something about them that you really benefit from, or you enjoy, or that you think is amazing. So he says, for example, the love of someone who does good for oneself, right? If somebody does lots of good things for you, is always doing good things for you, and you love them because of that, right? You're loving them for something external, so to speak, to who they are. It's not who they are, it's this thing that they're doing for you. And he goes on to say, in this situation, the lover doesn't really love the beloved, just the thing they receive from them. In essence, one only loves oneself. And this is like, again, the pure Freudian moments, right? He's saying here, you love somebody because they do good things for you. But in actuality, you really just love yourself because you love the good that they're doing for you. You love how it makes you feel. It's really all about you. Now, again, I'm not saying people that we love shouldn't do good things for us, but if that's what love is all about, that we love them because of the good things they're doing for us, that's really just about us. That's just narcissism. And that is potentially, problematic. From there, then he shifts to the question of unconditional love. So what's going on here? Is unconditional love possible? Is there a love beyond narcissism? So here's what he says. He says, love that's not dependent on something that's unconditional. He says, this occurs naturally, like one's love for their children and family, right? That's his first example of unconditional love, though we're going to see it's a little bit more complicated than that in a second. And the reason we would think of family, of children and family, is because like we sort of love them naturally. Like we don't have to from the moment our children are born, like we love them. Like we grow up in a home with our parents and siblings, like we love them. We don't have to look for external reasons. And another example potentially of unconditional love are passions, which here he talks about something intellectual in which a person loves the pursuit of wisdom, ethics, and fear of God, right? That these goods, these inherent goods, are things that we love just for what they are. When this person is asked why he loves these things, he does not know how to answer. This is one of my favorite lines because I use it all the time, even before I found this in the Tiferet Yisrael, this idea that the things that we love, that they exceed our capacity to explain why we love them, right? There's no amount of words that could really fully capture the love that we feel for the things that we love, right? Because there's ultimately something irrational about it at the end of the day. So he continues. he says, this is love that is not dependent on something. It's unconditional love as a means to an end between the lover and the beloved. However, even though he said, family could be unconditional love, right? This idea of wisdom, ethics, fear of God can be unconditional love. He points out that it's still kind of complicated. He says, when a person loves a sage or a righteous person or a tzaddik, it can also be considered dependent on something, meaning love can still be dependent even when you love somebody you think for good reasons. Like you love a sage because they know a lot of Torah, or you love a tzaddik because they're such a righteous person. That's still not maybe unconditional love, because when the sage stops engaging with wisdom, or when the tzaddik is maybe no longer righteous, you no longer love them. So if you love somebody because there's something about them that's really good or special or important, it's still not necessarily unconditional love. So we now have to flesh out a bit more what this means, because the biblical examples are going to be very important and helpful for us. So remember I said Amnon and Tamar. I don't know if you guys know the story. Amnon is King David's son, and Tamar is his sister-in-law or half-sister. Now, what happens, and this is more than a little bit unfortunate, is that Amnon falls in love with his half-sister Tamar because she's beautiful, and really because she's forbidden to him. There's a verse in Proverbs, right? Forbidden fruit is like the sweetest, and it's clear that unfortunately the incest dimension here is part of his attraction to her. And what happens is he lays a trap for Tamar. He pretends to be sick. He demands that she care for him, and when they're alone, he rapes her. And immediately after he has sex with her, the Torah says that he despises her, he hates her. He wants her gone immediately, and he throws her out of his room in total shame. And this is the example of ahava shtetluya b'davar. That's a love that's conditional love. And here's how Tiferet Yisrael explains it. He says, it's not Tamar that he loved. He didn't really love Tamar at all, but rather himself. This is pure narcissistic love because of the pleasure he expected to receive from her. It was all about the fantasy that he had of her, basically, and the pleasure that he was going to get with the fulfillment of that fantasy. And therefore, when his pleasure from her stopped, when the fantasy was fulfilled, it was written in the Torah, Amnon hated Tamar. However, he goes on to say, one could raise a difficulty. And this is where, again, that Tiferet Yisrael is interesting. He says that there is no example of interpersonal love that is not dependent on something, such that when the something no longer exists, the love stops. For a moment here, he is now completely like Freud, because he's saying, you know what? Maybe there's no such thing as unconditional love. Maybe all love is conditional on something. Like I fell in love with my wife because, again, like there were things about her that I liked, right? I mean, again, could I imagine anybody that I could fall in love with where there wouldn't be good reasons on some level to fall in love with them? And if that's the case, maybe there's no such thing as unconditional love. And he goes on to even say when it comes to family, he says the love of a father for his son, sorry, not his sin, but his son, proves this. For it is only self-love. For the son is the bone of his bones, the flesh of his flesh, right? That even our children, which we might think is the best example of unconditional love, like with a spouse, you love them because there's like a real pleasure that comes with them, right? All sorts of ways. But your children, maybe that's unconditional love because children bring a lot of pain and we still love them. But what the Tiferet Yisrael points out here is that even when we love our children, it's really kind of narcissistic love, because when we look at our children, what do we see? We see little versions of ourselves. We see little versions of ourselves in our spouse. And even if we don't literally see it, right, we put enough love and energy into them that that's the way it feels. Like we feel like they're part of us. And if that's the case, even when it comes to our children, maybe it's still narcissistic love. And Tiferet Yisrael goes on, he says, it's like the love one feels for their hand or their foot. And maybe this is not appropriate to be called love, right? So like Freud, he's questioning, is there anything beyond narcissistic love? And this is why the example of Yonatan and David is so important, right? That's why the Mishnah brings it here, because without it, we might not think there's a love beyond narcissistic love. So David and Yehonatan is a very interesting case. Their love, first off, is not romantic love. That's very clear, but it's something different. And maybe the fact it's not romantic love is what helps make it unconditional, because they're not getting that dimension out of it from each other. Not only does Yonatan love David, but this is the only place in the entire Torah, and this is very significant, the only place in the entire Torah where the expression v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha appears outside of Vayikra, outside that verse we saw before, is in this context. That it's very clear here, the Torah says, or the Sefer Shmuel, that when Yehonatan loves David, it says he loves him as himself, right? Which seems that if there's any example anywhere of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, it's here, because it's the only place that language is used. And what's interesting is, where does Yehonatan fall in love with David? He falls in love with him after David kills Goliath. He kills Goliath, right? The shepherd boy with his little sling kills Goliath. And he appears before Shaul holding Goliath's head in his hand, right? He's the victorious hero. This unassuming little shepherd boy is the one who basically saved the Jewish people, right? So the Torah says here in Sefer Shmuel, Shaul said to him, verse 58, "Whose son are you, my boy?" And David answered, "The son of your servant Yishai of Beit Lechem." And right at that moment, the very next verse, it says, when David finished speaking with Shaul, Yonatan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Yonatan loved David as himself. Right? That moment David appears, that's when Yehonatan falls in love with him. And it goes on to say, Shaul took David into his service. David's now going to, be in the in Shaul's court. He's going to serve him. He's not going to return home. And it says that Yonatan and David made a covenant together, a brit, because Yonatan loved David as himself. And not only that, what does Yonatan do? He actually takes off his cloak, his tunic, and everything he's wearing basically, and he gives it to David. It's a very, very interesting story and a very, very interesting example of what unconditional love might be. And again, not only does Yonatan love David here, important things happen. He makes a brit, a covenant with David, which means he's binding himself to David, right? He's making it clear that he feels responsible to David. You and I are connected now because of this love. And number two, he gives his clothes to David, which is surprising, to be honest, because Yonatan's the son of the king. He's the one who's going to take over, right? He's the one who's going to inherit the throne, and to take off his clothes in this important moment, to give them to David, is to show, in maybe the most profound way possible, the sense of commitment that he feels to David. It's Yonatan's way of saying, I would do anything for you. I would give you the clothes off my back, right? That's how much I connected, how much love I feel for you ultimately. And we know from later on in Sefer Shmuel, when Shaul is jealous of David and he wants to kill him, Yonatan risks his life again and again to help David, even though it means putting himself between Shaul, his father, the king, and David, right? And it's not easy to put your friend, basically, out ahead of your family. It's very difficult to put anybody ahead of your family, even the one you love. And in this case, Yehonatan does it, even risking his own life several times, but he does it because he loves David. And that's what you do for the people that you ultimately love. So I want us to look here how the Tiferet Yisrael understands this idea of Yehonatan and David's unconditional love, because it's very, very powerful, and I think very, very important if we want to think about what v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha really means. So here's what he says. He says, Yehonatan's love for David was not dependent on anything of this world, and it was of a great measure like the love of a father for his son, right? Yehonatan's love for David was unconditional, and the only other example of it we could think of is a parent for a child, even though we know that's not quite unconditional, because parents love their children because their children are basically like, extensions of themselves. But we know when it comes to parental love that it's almost unconditional, because kids can do the worst things and parents still love them. I think my parents are online, so I'm going to hold them accountable to that, right? But he says here, like the love of a father for a son, that can never be nullified, even when the son does not act appropriately, as was said by King David. King David later on, his son Avshalom actually kills his brother Amnon. Amnon rapes Tamar. Avshalom is Tamar's brother. And Avshalom then kills Amnon. And Avshalom also rebels against King David, his own father. And even when he's rebelling against his father, David says, you know what? Don't go too harshly on Avshalom, because he's my son. I love him, right? Even when his son is rebelling against him, trying to kill him, David still loves him, because that's what parental love is. That's really the closest example that we had to unconditional love, even though it's, like I said, not quite unconditional, because we still love our children in no small part because they are, like us, from us. And that's what David did too. So too Yehonatan, even after he heard that the kingship would be taken from him, even here he did not move from his love for David, right? He loves David, even though it's bad for him, even though it's going to mean that he's going to lose out on being king. It doesn't matter. He loves David. That's how you know, by the way, love is unconditional ultimately, is that you still love the person even when it's bad for you, even when it hurts you, even when it's, putting you in pain, but you still love them and you feel responsible to them. He risked his life several times for David. And what's fascinating here, this is maybe the most, psychoanalytic piece of this. He goes on then, the Tiferes Yisrael, to describe what's a real example of unconditional love. And it's what we see here with David and Yehonatan. He says, we find this example in the world, and he uses this Yiddish expression, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because I can't do it. But he says, "D'shnei bnei Adam afshlo akiru zeh et zeh me'olam, tekef kishir uzeh et zeh yehavu zeh lezeh b'litam." He says that it's when two people who did not know each other, all of a sudden, when they see each other for the first time, they fall in love for no reason. And then he goes on to say, "V'yesh lezeh tam ne'elam." There's a supernal hidden meaning to this idea, right? So what he's talking about here at the end is love at first sight. And the reason that love at first sight is unconditional love is because there's no good reason for it. Like, it just happens, which means it can't be conditioned on anything. It just happens to you. And that's what we see here actually with David and Yehonatan, right? Yehonatan just like sees David for the first time, and he falls in love with him. And that love binds him to him for the rest of his life, no matter what. So just to summarize here with the Tiferes Yisrael, unconditional love has basically three qualities. Nothing can nullify it. The beloved can do anything, and we still love them. We still feel responsible to them. Number two, we are responsible to them to the end. One would do anything for them, including giving up one's own life. Unconditional love is painful, like I said. It means doing things that often work against your own interest, including, like I said, being willing to give up your own life. And this is important because if you're willing to give up your life for someone, it means you aren't really getting anything out of it. Because what benefit can you claim to receive once you're dead? And again, that unconditional love almost has this love at first sight to it. It's just irrational, right? It just comes and you just feel it. Just like Yonatan felt for David, that we suddenly feel bound to the other, responsible to the other, and that we just can't escape it. Now, you might think this bar is too high, that this unconditional love of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha that Tiferes Yisrael is talking about here, that you can't do this. Like, even like my wife, I have to admit, like, is that love unconditional forever, no matter what? I mean, I would like to think so, absolutely. But I don't know. People get divorced, and am I willing to give up my life for my wife or for my kids? I'd like to think so, but again, it's a pretty tall order, and I know we're all, more than a little bit of narcissists, so it's really not easy. And also this idea of love at first sight. I have to be honest. I first met my wife Jen at a Hillel meeting. She was the representative from Smith College. I was the representative from UMass Amherst, and I definitely thought she was cute when I first saw her. But I can't say it was love at first sight. But here's the thing, and this I think is really important. The Maharal, in his commentary on this Mishnah, he makes a fascinating point. He says that love is actually never absolutely conditional or unconditional. It's always a bit of a mix of the two. Every relationship has some measure of both, and it's always a question of proportion, right? So some relationships are more unconditional love, less conditional love, and most relationships are more conditional love, but at least there's always some unconditional love in there too. Unconditional love is always in there in some of those relationships somewhere if we open our eyes to it. And the way we feel bound to it, to the person that we love, in a way that far exceeds whatever words we might use to explain it, right? That's where the unconditional love is, that sense that we are bound to people that we love and we just can't escape them no matter how hard we try. Right? That's where the unconditional love is, even if there's a lot of conditional love in there too. So to bring it all together, I just want to conclude with a couple of pieces from Franz Rosenzweig, the great German philosopher, who offers basically, you didn't know this, but Rosenzweig has been hovering in the background of all of this year because his understanding of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha really influenced how I read all of these other sources. Like Rav Kook, he sees love as a redemptive force. He sees V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? That's ahavat chinam, that unconditional love, as being transformative. And the reason for that is that Rosenzweig believes that God's love transforms us and ultimately orients the way we relate towards the other. And that's what revelation is for him. It's an experience of God's love. And we know this from the Jewish tradition, right? The greatest moments of revelation in the Jewish tradition is Har Sinai, right? And for the rabbis, that's a moment of love. That's a moment of covenant. That's a moment of marriage. It's a wedding. In fact, the Midrash says that when God lifts up the mountain, it's to be the chuppah for God and the Jewish people, and that moment is a moment when God showers us in a love, and that ultimately transforms us, and it transforms the way that we relate to others. So here's the 3 points Franz Rosenzweig makes about V'ahavta L'Recha Kamocha, and I think it sums up everything we've been saying so far. And for Rosenzweig, he believes, as the Tiferet Yisrael believed, even though Freud didn't, is that there is a love that's not narcissistic. And it's a love that on some level begins with God, right? Because the relationship with God is one that fundamentally forces us to confront something beyond ourselves, right? God's not a human being. Like, that's a fundamental principle of Judaism. God is something beyond what we can know and understand, which means to encounter God is to encounter something that's fundamentally unlike us. And if we can encounter God, which is something fundamentally unlike us, then we can potentially also encounter human beings, which are different from us, which are strange or differ from us in all sorts of ways. Number one, he makes the point that we don't love the neighbor because they're easy to love. He says the neighbor is therefore only a representative. He's not loved for himself. He's not loved for his beautiful eyes, but only because he is just there, right? We don't love the neighbor because they're pretty. Right? We love the neighbor because they're in front of us. And we have, therefore, a responsibility to them. One of the most important points for Rosenzweig is that love is not universal in the way that maybe Christianity thinks about it. So we're supposed to love like everybody, right? Love is an obligation, but love for Rosenzweig and for Judaism is always about the person in front of you, right? It's like the idea in tzedakah, like who do you give tzedakah to first? It's always aniyei irecha, right? The poor people of your city. Those closest to you are the ones who are, most deserving of your love because they're right there. They're flesh and blood human beings in front of you. And that's his first point. But you don't love the neighbor because they're pretty and they look like you. They love the neighbor because you're there and you encounter them. And you recognize, hopefully, as you encounter them, that you are connected to them, and that you're bound to them, and that you are responsible to them in a very, very significant way. He continues here. He says, it's not said to him by God to do unto the neighbor what he would like done to himself. This practical form of the commandment of love of the neighbor, serving as a rule of conduct, really only designates the lower negative limit. Meaning this idea that you should love the neighbor means do the good things for the neighbor that you like done for you. Rosenzweig saying this like true to a certain extent, but that's just the very basic level of the mitzvah. Right? If the mitzvahs only do good things for people because they're the good things that you like, that's the floor. It's not the ceiling. Really, the commandment is pushing us beyond that. He says the commandment forbids crossing over this limit in action, and already for this reason alone, it will be better to express it even outwardly in a negative form. Meaning, if the mitzvah is about action in a concrete sense, it's best formulated as not do to other people what you would like, but don't do to other people what you don't like, because that's actually a little bit clearer, right? We know that's the way that Hillel formulates it when the convert comes to him. But this is really the key line here. For a man must love his neighbor as himself. But here's the key thing. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But up until now, we've been almost interpreting that narcissistically. Love the neighbor because they're like you. But here's the thing, Rosenzweig points out. Like you, kamocha, doesn't mean they are you. And this is significant, meaning you should love the neighbor because they're like you, but they're not you. They're also really different from you. And for Rosenzweig, the point is that we can love people who are different because in truth, everybody's different, right? There's nobody who's exactly like me, right? And the biggest challenge of love is learning to love the otherness, the difference within the people all around us, because it's so easy for us to love the parts of them that are like us, the parts of us that we like, and it's so hard to us to love the parts that aren't. But that's what V'ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha is about. You love them because they're like you, but they're ultimately not you. And that takes us to the last point here about this idea of V'ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha, loving the person who's not like us, that's not narcissistic love. And from Rosenzweig, it's redemptive. He says the bridge that leads from the I to the he, from revelation to creation, meaning the bridge that leads from God to human being, then to human being to another human being, that bridge, on it is written, love the other, right? For he is not an other, not a he, but an I like you. He is like you again, but not you, right? Similar, but ultimately different. And this is the key line. For what else is redemption but that the I learns to say you to the he? So I have to explain what this means. How does redemption get manifest for Rosenzweig? In the ability to say you to the he. And what does this mean? Well, we have to remember again, what's the neighbor? The neighbor is the one always just beyond us. Wherever we are, the neighbor is the one just beyond us. We look out from our home, wherever it is. It could be our actual home. Maybe it's the place we work, or maybe it's the shul. Wherever it is, it's the place where we feel comfortable with people like us. But we look out from our home, because that's always where the neighbor is, just beyond the home, and inevitably see somebody else. Someone who may be like us to a certain extent, at least a little bit, but somebody who's also ultimately different from us. And what do we do in that moment? So we initially see them as a he, as an it. But what Rosenzweig is saying is the ultimate challenge in that moment of V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha is not to see them as a he or as an it, but as a you, right? It's very different to call somebody a you versus a he. And we make this shift from he to you by calling out to them. Because in that moment, we call out to them and we say you, we look them in the eye. And what we're essentially doing is taking responsibility for them. Because once you say you to another person, it means you're in a relationship with them and that they now matter. And this is the hard part. It's really hard. If love is too often about looking in the mirror and seeing only ourselves, V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha, ahavat chinam, redemptive love is about so much more. It's about moving beyond narcissistic love to embrace the other, even though they're other, even though they're different, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's painful, even though it places obligations on us, even though it places responsibilities on us, even though it might even be bad for us, but we're bound to them because we have to love them, because that's what it means to be a human being in this world, created in the image of God, that we have to love other people. And we don't start with the world because that would be impossible. And our family is obviously very important, but the challenge is always to go for the neighbor, the one that's just beyond us, the one that's, again, similar, but ultimately very different from us. And there's always a neighbor. Wherever you are, there's always a neighbor right there, just beyond the walls. And it's hard to do V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha. It's redemptive, which means it's almost impossible to move beyond that narcissistic love. But we have to try because it's that kind of love that really, 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 really matters. So I want to thank everybody. Happy to know I went a little bit over, but